They told me, "We're leaving tonight, Mom. You're not coming." They thought I would break. But they had no idea what I already knew, or what I had already done. After years of unread messages, silent betrayals, and plans they whispered behind my back, I finally chose myself. So when they stepped outside and tried to come back in, their keys didn't work. And neither did their excuses. This is the story of the night my own children realized the door they walked through so carelessly no longer opened for them. Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel as we have a special story that'll be released soon. I was sitting in the living room folding laundry when the words landed in the air like something heavy enough to crack the floor beneath us. My son stood in front of me, arms crossed, eyes fixed anywhere but my face. My daughter hovered behind him, twisting her phone between her fingers as if she'd rather be anywhere else. They didn't ease into it. They didn't hesitate. They didn't even sit down. "We're leaving tonight, Mom. You're not coming." For a moment it didn't register. The dryer hummed in the hallway. A bird tapped against the window. The house smelled like the chicken stew I'd been simmering for hours. It was such an ordinary moment that the sentence sounded misplaced, like it belonged to someone else's life, someone else's family, someone else's children. I looked up slowly, waiting for one of them to soften, to explain, to laugh and admit this was some kind of misunderstanding. But their expressions stayed flat, rehearsed. My son's jaw was locked. My daughter wouldn't even look at me. And then I noticed the bags, lined by the doorway, zippers closed, shoes ready. All of it neatly arranged like a getaway scene. "How long have you been planning this?" I asked, my voice too calm, too even, as if it belonged to someone trying not to disturb a wild animal. My daughter finally exhaled, as though holding her breath had taken effort. "A while," she answered, her tone clipped, almost bored. They exchanged a glance, the kind that holds meaning I wasn't included in. A silent conversation spoken behind my back long before this moment. They had made their decision without me, around me, and seemingly in spite of me. I looked at the laundry on my lap. One of my son's shirts, a sweater my daughter liked to wear when she borrowed my clothes, a towel that still smelled faintly of the lavender detergent they always teased me for using. All the little remnants of a home I thought we shared. "Why tonight?" I whispered. My son shifted, suddenly restless, tapping his keys against his thigh. "Because it's time," he said. "We've outgrown this place. And we just need space. You understand." But I didn't. Not in the way he meant. What I understood was the way they refused to meet my eyes. The way their bodies leaned toward the door even as they spoke. The way they had already left emotionally. And this was just them finally informing me. My daughter stepped forward for the first time, but not to hug me. She reached for one of the bags. "We're not asking, Mom. We're telling you." A coldness settled over me then. Not anger, not shock, but a quiet awareness. Something in me clicked into place. Something that had been preparing for this even when I didn't want to admit it. I folded the shirt in my hands and stood slowly. "Then go," I said. My voice didn't shake. They walked out with the certainty of people who believed they held all the power. What they didn't know, what they never cared to ask, was that I already changed the locks. They stood in front of me. My children, yet not quite my children anymore. And for the first time I noticed how their mouths didn't move unless someone else's permission seemed to guide them. My daughter's husband, Jason, leaned his shoulder against the doorframe like he owned the house, answering questions I hadn't asked, slipping into the silence before she could form her own words. My son's wife, Brianna, remained glued to his arm, speaking over him, correcting him, sighing loudly whenever he started to say something that didn't fit the script she clearly rehearsed with him beforehand. It felt like watching puppets attached to invisible strings, strings pulled not by life or circumstance, but by the two people standing beside them with polished confidence and practiced authority. I kept looking at my children's eyes, searching for something familiar. Softness, independence, humor, the spark that used to define them. But all I found was resignation, compliance, a stillness that didn't belong to the boy who used to defend his sister from playground bullies, or the girl who once declared she wanted to be an astronaut because the world was too small to hold all her dreams. I listened as their spouses explained things my children had once spoken about freely. Jason answered when I asked where they planned to stay. My daughter just nodded along, her smile tight and nervous. Brianna jumped in when I asked my son why they hadn't told me sooner, dismissing the question with a sharp, "We all make decisions you don't need to be involved in." My son didn't correct her. He didn't even try. The truth began to settle in my chest like a slow, heavy ache. They had been slipping away long before tonight. It didn't happen in an instant. It happened in pieces. A missed Sunday dinner here, a cancelled birthday visit there. Gradual, quiet withdrawals disguised as busyness and adulthood. I remembered the first time my daughter failed to return my call for a week. I told myself she was overwhelmed at work. The first time my son forgot he promised to help me fix the porch light. I told myself he simply lost track of time. But those were early signs, subtle ones, warnings I didn't want to acknowledge. And now, staring at them with their spouses speaking for them, I realized they had slowly become shadows, echoes of their own decisions replaced by someone else's expectations. My daughter laughed too loudly at a joke Jason made, even though it wasn't funny. My son looked at Brianna before answering me, gauging her reaction with the quiet fear of someone who had been corrected too many times. Every movement, every breath, every gesture revealed a truth I wasn't ready to face. The children I raised with gentleness and trust had been shaped into something else entirely under the weight of people who only saw me as an obstacle. I kept searching their faces for pieces of the kids I once knew. The girl who cried when her goldfish died because she believed everything deserved love. The boy who used to bring me wildflowers from the backyard just to make me smile. All those versions of them felt distant now, like old photographs left in the sun too long, fading into pale outlines of what used to be. As I watched their spouses speak over them again, directing the conversation like stage managers, I felt a small, steady shift inside me. Quiet understanding. My children weren't choosing to leave me tonight. They had already left long before this moment. I just hadn't noticed the door closing behind them until now. I walked into the hallway while they stood in the living room discussing their timeline, and the air changed around me the way it does when a house knows it's being judged by people who no longer see it as home. My footsteps echoed softly against the wood floors Jeremiah, and I refinished when the kids were still small, when they used to slide across them in socks and laugh so loud it filled every corner. Those echoes felt different now. Emptier, somehow embarrassed, as if the house itself understood the way they were speaking about it. My eyes drifted to the wall. The photos were still there, arranged exactly as they'd been for years. Family vacations, first days of school, their gap-toothed smiles, their awkward teenage phases. Each frame held a version of them that loved this place without question, without hesitation. I ran my fingers along the edges, feeling the dust I had been meaning to wipe, the same dust that now seemed to offend them. In the doorway leading to the kitchen, the pencil markings still stood, 12 years of height measurements. Tiny scribbles climbing inch by inch, memories etched into wood that I could never bring myself to paint over. I remembered how they used to stand on tiptoe to cheat, how they'd laugh when I caught them, how they'd beg me to measure them again the next week. Now those marks were nothing more than dated decor, according to Brianna, who once suggested we update the place. As I walked back into the living room, I heard them discussing the house like it was a burden they'd been forced to carry. "The plumbing is old," my son muttered. "The neighborhood is too quiet," my daughter added. Their spouses chimed in with comments about resale value, square footage, renovations no one asked for. Every word chipped away at something in me I didn't know was still breakable. They spoke about my home, their home, as if it were a cage. As if the walls that once protected them now suffocated them. As if the place that held their scraped knees, birthday parties, school projects, weeping heartbreaks, and whispered bedtime stories was nothing more than a structure past its usefulness. I felt the distance growing with every casual critique. The house they once ran through barefoot was now too small. The kitchen that fed them for decades was outdated. Even the garden, where they planted their first sunflower seeds, was too much maintenance. It stung in a way I didn't let show. Not because of the house itself, but because of what it revealed. They didn't just want to leave. They wanted to abandon everything that built them. My daughter glanced toward the hallway and shrugged. It's not like we'll miss anything here. I swallowed hard. I wondered if she remembered the night she slept beside me on the couch after a nightmare, curled up under my arm while the storm beat against the windows. Or if my son remembered the Saturdays we baked cookies until the whole house smelled like warm sugar. Maybe those memories mattered only to me now. I stood there quietly, listening as they spoke about escape routes, new cities, bigger houses, better opportunities. And for the first time I didn't try to convince them to stay. I simply watched them speak like strangers passing through a place that meant nothing. The house still felt like home to me, but to them it was already a place they'd outgrown, a chapter they were eager to close, a weight they were desperate to shake off. And in that moment I realized something painful and undeniable. They didn't see this house the way I did anymore. They didn't see me either. There were moments, even as they spoke with such coldness in the present, when my mind slipped backward without permission, dragging me through years of quiet sacrifices I had made so naturally that I never thought to call them sacrifices at all. Back then, giving had felt like breathing, instinctive, constant, unquestioned. And because it was instinctive for me, it became expected for them. I remembered the nights I stayed up sorting through financial aid paperwork for my son's college, calculating numbers until my eyes blurred. He was asleep in his room while I sat at the kitchen table with a calculator that had lost half its buttons and a mug of coffee gone cold hours ago. When the aid didn't fully cover his tuition, I dipped into the small savings account I had been building for years, the one I had once planned to use to fix the roof or finally take a vacation. I never told him. I just paid it. He never asked how. My daughter's wedding felt like a whirlwind I never had time to breathe through. She wanted something grand, something memorable, something Instagram perfect. And I wanted her to have everything she dreamed of, even if it meant cashing out a retirement fund early to cover the unexpected costs she and her fiancé suddenly couldn't manage. Paid the florist. I paid the venue deposit. I paid the caterer the morning of the ceremony because their card had issues. She never noticed the strain. She was too busy smiling for the photos. Then came the rent shortages, the emergencies, the broken-down cars, the lost jobs, the sudden repairs, the overdraft fees. Every time my phone rang with their numbers, I already knew what the conversation would be. There was always a sigh, a long pause, an explanation rehearsed enough to sound natural but rushed enough to disguise the pattern. And I helped, every time. Without hesitation. Without resentment. Or at least I told myself that. They never visited unless something was falling apart in their own lives. They never stopped by for a cup of coffee or a Sunday meal unless they needed a check slipped into their hands. The house was a resource, not a refuge. I became the emergency fund they didn't have, the safety net they never built, the person they called only when the world disappointed them. Birthdays turned into rushed phone calls. Holidays became optional. They always had somewhere else to be, someone else to see. Something more important than the woman who kept saving them from quietly drowning in their own unpreparedness. And yet, year after year I continued giving. Not because they demanded, but because they were my children. Because I believed love meant showing up even when they didn't. As I stood there in the present, listening to them discuss leaving without me, I realized the truth I had never allowed myself to articulate. They had always taken without thinking. And I had always given without boundaries. That kind of imbalance doesn't stay invisible forever. It grows, it hardens. It becomes the foundation for relationships built on expectation rather than gratitude. Now, watching them stand there with their bags packed, dismissing the house and the life we shared, I could see the years stacked behind them. All the meals I cooked, the bills I paid, the shoulders I offered, the nights I waited up, the days spent worrying over children who only remembered me when the world told them no. It wasn't just that they had taken. It was that they never thought to stay. They never thought to give back. And maybe, deep down, they never learned how. It began with whispers behind closed doors, soft enough to pretend they weren't meant for me, loud enough that I could hear every syllable when the house fell quiet at night. My daughter-in-law's sharp voice drifting down the hallway, complaining about how cramped the guest room felt, how the walls were too close together, how she could never imagine raising children in a place this outdated. My son-in-law would hum in agreement, adding his own criticisms. The neighborhood wasn't up and coming, the appliances were ancient, the decor was stuck in the past. They said the word past like it was something rotten. I learned quickly that they didn't whisper because they didn't want to be heard. They whispered because they wanted my children to choose sides in the quiet, steady battle that had begun the moment they moved in. They never outright insulted me in front of my face, but they didn't have to. Every complaint was designed to wedge my children further away from me, to make the life I had built seem small and unworthy when compared to the shiny lives they imagined for themselves. It started with little things. My daughter stopped helping me cook because her husband preferred ordering food. My son stopped watching old movies with me because his wife said the Wi-Fi barely worked in the living room unless she was the one using it. They began spending more time in their rooms, emerging only when they needed something or when their spouses nudged them forward with carefully disguised impatience. The house stopped feeling like mine. Suddenly, there were shoes in the hallway I didn't recognize, candles with scents I didn't buy, new rules about where things should go, and comments about how I should modernize to keep up. They rearranged furniture without asking, changed the channels when I was watching something, and used phrases like "your generation" in a tone that made age feel like a flaw rather than an experience. It didn't take long for the social distance to turn emotional. My daughter would look at her husband before answering me, as if my questions required his approval. My son would cut conversations short because Brianna needed him for something, even when she was sitting right there doing nothing at all. I watched them slowly adopt the same vocabulary, the same dismissive gestures, the same impatience that didn't belong to them before. One evening I overheard Brianna laughing softly saying, "Your mom means well, but this lifestyle is so nostalgic. People don't live like this anymore." Jason answered, "She's stuck in her ways. It's time for all of us to move forward." Forward, another word that sliced deeper than they knew. I stood in the hallway unseen, holding a basket of folded towels, realizing I had become a guest in my own house. Their house now, in their minds. A place they were temporarily tolerating until something better came along. Every whisper, every sigh, every exchanged look chipped away at the home I had nurtured for decades. My children didn't defend me. They didn't disagree. They didn't remind their spouses that this was the house that raised them, the house that held their childhoods, the house where every corner held a memory. They simply stood there, quiet, letting someone else rewrite the meaning of the place I had built from nothing. And as I listened, unseen and unacknowledged, I understood something I wished I hadn't. The spouses hadn't taken my children from me all at once. They had been peeling them away in layers, shaping them, molding them, persuading them, until the children I loved were almost unrecognizable, their love replaced with something that felt more like embarrassment than affection. That night, for the first time, I closed my bedroom door and locked it. It was the smallest boundary I had ever set in my own home. And yet it already felt like I was preparing for something far bigger. It happened on a quiet Wednesday afternoon, the kind of day that should have passed without consequence. I had made lunch for everyone, simple sandwiches, nothing elaborate, and set them on the table the way I always had. But no one came. I called their names once, then twice, and finally went looking for them, thinking maybe they hadn't heard me. I found them all in the living room, gathered around their phones, absorbed in their own small worlds. My daughter-in-law glanced up first, her expression annoyed as if I had interrupted something important. My son didn't look up at all. When I reminded them that lunch was ready, my son sighed loudly, the way he used to when he was a teenager and thought the entire world was conspiring to inconvenience him. "Mom," he said, rubbing the back of his neck, "you don't have to make us food every day. You're being too emotional about everything lately." Too emotional. The words dropped between us like a stone into water, heavy enough to send ripples in every direction. For a moment, I wasn't standing in my own living room. I was standing in some unfamiliar place where my son spoke to me in a voice that didn't belong to him. He sounded like someone else. He sounded rehearsed. Before I could respond, my daughter chimed in, arms crossed. "He's right. You're holding us back. We're adults now. We don't need you hovering over us. Hovering. It felt like a slap I didn't see coming. I thought of every late-night conversation she and I shared growing up, every time she had crawled into my bed after a nightmare, every moment she had turned to me with her fears, her hopes, her heartbreaks. Hovering. As if my love had been a weight instead of a shelter. I looked at them both, really looked. My son's eyes darted to his wife, waiting for approval. My daughter's posture mirrored her husband's, arms crossed, chin lifted, impatience radiating off her like heat. They weren't talking to me from their own hearts. They were speaking from borrowed opinions, mimicking the people who had slowly taken root in the spaces of their lives that used to belong to me. You don't have to take care of us, my son added, softer but distant. We can manage without all this. He gestured vaguely at the house, the food, the routines, everything that had once been home. I wasn't trying to control anything, I said quietly. I was just being a mother. My daughter rolled her eyes. Exactly. That's the problem. We don't need mothering anymore. The room felt colder, smaller, as if the walls were listening and grieving with me. My hands trembled, not from anger but from the sudden understanding that I had been replaced, not by better love but by louder voices. Voices that criticized me behind closed doors, voices that taught my children to see care as suffocation and love as inconvenience. I realized then that I was no longer the person they turned to. I was the person they pushed aside. They didn't need me, not because they had grown beyond needing a mother, but because someone had convinced them that needing me was a weakness. I stood there in silence, letting their words settle. There were things I wanted to say, reminders I wanted to give, memories I wanted to hold up like a mirror so they could see the truth. But none of it would reach them. Not in the state they were in. Not with the armor they wore that wasn't theirs. So I picked up the sandwiches, wrapped them neatly, and placed them in the fridge. It was the first small act of withdrawal. And in that moment, I understood that motherhood had shifted without warning, from being their foundation to being treated like an obstacle. I had not changed. They had. I had been watching the distance grow for weeks, maybe months, but that evening I made one last attempt to bridge it. It wasn't dramatic or planned. It came from a place inside me that still believed mothers could fix things by feeding the people they loved. So I stood at the kitchen counter chopping vegetables, preparing their favorite dish the way I used to when they were teenagers, when food could pull them out of their rooms and coax laughter out of them even on their worst days. The smell filled the house, warm and familiar. It drifted through the hallway, just like it always did, curling around corners and reaching the living room where they sat whispering with their spouses. I listened for footsteps, for a soft, "It smells good, Mom," for anything that suggested they remembered the comfort that lived in this kitchen. But nothing came. So I stepped into the doorway, drying my hands on a towel. "Dinner will be ready in a few minutes," I said, trying to sound casual, trying not to sound like I was asking for anything more than their presence. My son didn't look up from his phone. My daughter exchanged a glance with her husband, the kind that held a silent conversation I wasn't invited to. When she finally spoke, her voice lacked even the smallest thread of affection. "We're not staying, Mom." The words didn't shock me, not really. But something inside me still folded. "It's your favorite," I said quietly. "I thought we could sit together, talk a little." My son's wife sighed like I was exhausting her. "We've already eaten," she said, though I could see untouched takeout containers on the table. "We're trying to get things done." My daughter shrugged. "We're leaving tonight. We don't have time for dinner." Leaving. The finality in her voice was sharp, as if the chapter of this home, of this family, was something she could close with a single sentence. I looked at her husband, who stood behind her with his arms crossed, already positioned as the decision-maker in a house he'd spent more time criticizing than appreciating. My son finally glanced up, but only long enough to say, "It's just dinner, Mom. Don't make it a big deal." But it wasn't just dinner. It was the last piece of a home I was trying desperately to hold together. It was memory and comfort and all the pieces of motherhood I had left to offer. And they brushed it aside like an inconvenience. I stepped back into the kitchen and stirred the pot slowly. The wooden spoon scraped the bottom in long, tired circles. I realized then that I wasn't losing them tonight. They had been leaving in small ways for years. Every missed holiday, every forgotten birthday, every visit that lasted only as long as they needed something. They were already halfway out the door emotionally. And this moment only revealed what had been true all along. I plated the food anyway. Not because I believed they would change their minds, but because cooking for them was the last thread of hope I needed to release gently rather than snap apart. The table sat set for 4, just as it always had, even though the chairs remained empty. Outside the kitchen I heard more whispering, more planning, more discussion about the life they were stepping into. A life that no longer included dinners in this house, conversations at this table, or a mother who tried too hard to keep them close. When I finally turned off the stove, I understood something clearly, painfully. They weren't rejecting the meal. They were rejecting the place in this family that used to belong to them, one they no longer wanted. And I stopped trying to pull them back. It happened so simply, so cleanly, that for a moment I wondered if I had misheard them. There was no build-up, no trembling voices, no dramatic pause before the blow. My son just stepped into the doorway of the kitchen, leaned his shoulder against the frame, and spoke the words with the flat tone of someone reminding a coworker about a meeting. "We're leaving tonight, Mom. You're not coming." My daughter was right behind him, arms folded, eyes fixed on a point somewhere over my head. Their spouses hovered near the stairs, half listening, half smirking at the efficiency of it all. They watched the scene unfold with the casualness of people handling a matter already settled long before they bothered to inform the one person it affected most. My hands were still damp from washing dishes. The pot of food I'd made sat warm on the stove. The kitchen light hummed softly above me. It struck me in a strange detached way. How ordinary everything looked while my world shifted by a fraction. Almost imperceptible, yet final in a way I could feel deep in my bones. I didn't ask where they were going. I didn't ask why tonight. I didn't ask how long they had planned this, even though the neatly packed bags by the front door already answered that. I just listened. Listening had always been my role anyway. Listening when they explained their problems. Listening when they needed money. Listening when they rehearsed grievances sculpted by someone else's voice. My son cleared his throat, uncomfortable with my silence. "It's better this way," he added, as if that explanation should comfort me. "We need to be on our own." My daughter shifted from foot to foot. "And well, you'll be fine. You don't need to worry about us anymore." The irony stung. Worrying about them had been the thread holding my life together for decades, woven so tightly into my days that I didn't remember what life looked like without it. They didn't realize that telling a mother to stop worrying is like telling the moon to stop pulling the tide. Still, I didn't argue. Something in me had grown quiet, a silence deeper than shock, deeper than grief. Not acceptance exactly, but clarity. The kind that comes when the truth finally stands naked in front of you with no excuses left. My son-in-law walked by, brushing past me as though I were furniture. "We'll grab our things in a minute," he muttered, as if he were being polite by announcing it. Brianna avoided my eyes entirely, her focus already on the life waiting beyond this house. I wiped my hands on a towel and nodded once. That was all. No pleading. No desperate grabbing at what was already gone. I had learned through painful, slow years that begging for love from people who treat you as an afterthought only deepens the wound. My silence made them uneasy. They expected a scene, tears, maybe even an argument they could use to justify their decision further. But I gave them none of it. I let the words settle into the walls of the kitchen, let them echo faintly between the fridge hum and the sound of their hurried footsteps. As they moved around gathering the last of their things, a strange calm washed over me. It wasn't peace, not yet. But it was the beginning of something close. A realization that this moment wasn't an ending they were imposing on me. It was an ending I had already sensed. And it was a beginning they had no idea I had prepared for. Because while they whispered and planned and packed, believing I would stand frozen in helplessness, I had already taken the one step they would never expect. I had already changed the locks. She had sensed it long before they ever said the words. It wasn't one moment, but a collection of them. Small, unsettling shifts that crept into her days like shadows lengthening across a floor. The hushed conversations behind doors that used to stay open. The sudden interest her children showed in documents they never cared about before. The way their spouses walked through the house as though assessing it, not living in it. Something in the air had changed, and though no one said it aloud, she felt it settling in her bones like the onset of a storm. She had learned long ago that mothers develop instincts sharper than warnings. And hers had been whispering to her for months. So earlier that week, when the house was empty for a rare few hours, she stood in her driveway with a small paper bag from the hardware store. Inside were new locks, heavier than the ones she'd had for years, newer, cleaner, untouched by anyone else's hands. The cashier had asked casually, "Installing new ones?" And she had simply nodded, not trusting her voice to form the truth. She changed each lock slowly, methodically, the way one mends a torn quilt with patience instead of speed. She removed the old screws one by one, noticing how worn they had become, scratched, faded, familiar. The old locks came off easily, almost too easily, and that alone unsettled her. How long had it been since she had last reinforced them? How many times had she left her home vulnerable because she believed no one in her family would ever take advantage of her trust? By the time she installed the last lock, the sun had dipped behind the trees, casting the house in warm orange light. She wiped sweat from her forehead and stood back, staring at the new metal gleaming against the door. It wasn't spiteful. It wasn't symbolic. It was survival. She did it because the home she'd built was the last thing she truly had left. The last thing she could rely on. Her children had drifted so far into the orbit of their spouses that she no longer recognized their silhouettes when they walked past her in the hallway. They spoke at her, not to her. They made decisions without her. They moved through her home like temporary guests waiting for an opportunity to leave, and possibly take what they wanted with them. She didn't change the locks to keep them out forever. She changed them because she needed a boundary strong enough to remind herself that she had a right to peace too. A right to choose who entered her space, who stood in her kitchen, who walked across the memories embedded into her floors. She kept the old keys on the counter for a moment before dropping them into a small box she'd tucked away in her bedroom drawer. It felt like closing a chapter she'd never meant to end, but one she could no longer deny. Mothers aren't supposed to protect themselves from their children, but sometimes, heartbreakingly, they must. And so when her children delivered the sentence that was meant to break her, when they stood in her living room saying the words with cold certainty, "We're leaving tonight, Mom. You're not coming," she didn't tremble. She didn't argue. She didn't beg. Because she had already done the hardest thing days before. Chosen herself. Chosen her sanity. Her privacy. Her home. And when they stepped outside to grab one last thing, unaware of what she had already secured, the truth settled quietly inside her. The locks were changed. Not in anger, but in preparation for a world where she finally stopped giving everything away. For once, she had protected herself before anyone else could try to take something more. They stepped outside together, all four of them saying they needed one last thing from the car. I watched from the kitchen doorway as they moved with the confidence of people who believed they would come right back inside, untouched, unquestioned, unchallenged. My daughter-in-law held her phone up, checking something on the screen. My son-in-law walked ahead, already talking about the route they would take, as if the house they were leaving behind was nothing more than a rest stop on a longer journey. My son and daughter followed, not looking back. The moment the door closed behind them, a hush fell over the house. It wasn't silence, it was relief. The kind that comes when pressure lifts, even for a moment. I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding and placed one hand on the counter to steady myself. It took less than 2 minutes before I heard the first rattle of a key in the lock. Then another. Then a frustrated exhale. I walked toward the front hallway slowly, not rushing, not dreading. I stood on the other side of the door and listened as their confusion grew in waves. Why isn't it turning? Try yours. It's not working. It's like stuck. That can't be right. Try again. The metallic click-click-click of unsuccessful attempts echoed like a rhythm I had been waiting to hear. 4 years the power had been slipping from my hands, quietly, invisibly, and for once the balance tilted back toward me. Footsteps shuffled. Voices rose. My daughter's voice came first, sharp with irritation. "Mom!" The locks jammed. My son jiggled the handle harder. "Mom, open the door. Something's wrong with it." But nothing was wrong. Nothing except the illusion they had lived under. The belief that no matter how they spoke to me, no matter how they dismissed me, the door to my home and my heart would always open for them. Their spouses moved closer. I could hear it in the shift of the porch boards. Brianna's voice cut through the air, accusing, entitled. "Did you change the locks? Are you serious right now?" Jason chimed in, angrier. "Open the door. This is ridiculous." The anger grew not from fear, but from entitlement. They believed access was theirs by default, that I would always choose them even when they refused to choose me. For the first time I didn't. I placed my hand on the door, not to open it, but to hold it closed with a strength I didn't know I had. My breathing steadied. My spine straightened. My daughter's voice cracked, caught between annoyance and disbelief. "Mom, why aren't you opening? What's going on?" I could hear my son twisting the knob again with increasing desperation. "Mom, seriously, open the door." Their fists thudded against the wood, first lightly, then harder. But the door didn't move. Not an inch. Inside I felt something subtle but powerful shift. I wasn't hiding. I wasn't scared. I was standing behind a door I had chosen to protect, a boundary I had created before they could take anything more from me. My space, my peace, my sense of safety. For years, I had stood on the weak side of every argument, every dismissal, every emotional blow. But tonight the imbalance broke. They were outside demanding entry. And I was inside deciding. "Mom!" My daughter yelled again, her voice cracking with something she didn't expect to feel. Fear of losing access, fear of losing the upper hand. I didn't answer yet. I let the silence sit between us, heavy and honest. Behind that closed door, for the first time in a very long time, I felt something close to power. Not revenge. Not cruelty. Just a reclaiming of something that had slipped from my life piece by piece. They had taken their bags and walked out as if the world waited for them. But when they tried to return, without respect, without gratitude, without accountability, they found a door that no longer opened for them automatically. A door that now required something they had forgotten how to give. And for the first time I knew I would not open it just because they demanded it. They had walked out, and I had finally chosen not to follow. I stood with my hand resting flat against the door, feeling the vibrations of their fists, their voices, their rising panic. It was strange how steady I felt while they unraveled on the other side. My heart wasn't racing. My breath didn't shake. It was as if the truth had settled into me so deeply that nothing they said could bruise me anymore. When I finally spoke, my voice came out calm, so calm that the knocking stopped instantly. "I'm here," I said. "You don't have to pound." There was a beat of stunned silence. Then my son spoke, confused, angry, desperate. "Mom, open the door." "What are you doing?" I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the quiet strengthen me. "I'm doing what I should have done a long time ago," I said. "I'm listening to what you've shown me. Not what you say, what you do." Another pause. Then my daughter's voice, sharp and defensive. "Mom, stop being dramatic. Just let us in so we can talk." "You never wanted to talk," I replied gently. "You wanted to decide." Footsteps shifted on the porch. Someone inhaled. Someone else whispered something too low for me to catch. I imagined their faces. Shock, frustration, disbelief that the woman they had grown used to dismissing now stood behind a door she had closed herself. And then I told them the part they never expected me to know. "I heard the conversation," I said. "The one in the kitchen last week." Thump. My son swore under his breath. The guilt hit them quicker than anything I could have said. "I know about the plan to sell the house," I continued. "Behind my back. Without telling me. Without even giving me time to breathe." Mom, my daughter started, but I didn't let her rewrite the story. I know about the assisted living facility, I said, my voice still steady. The one you toured without me. The one you said would be easier. Because you didn't want the burden of me living with you. Silence. Heavy. Embarrassed. My daughter-in-law broke it, her tone defensive and brittle. We were just exploring options. I cut her off softly. You weren't exploring. You were deciding. Planning. Hiding. Someone exhaled sharply, the sound of a lie collapsing. I also know, I added, about the account you tried to access. My account. The one you thought I wouldn't notice you logged into. This time no one spoke. Not even a whisper. That's why I changed the locks, I said. Not out of anger. Not out of revenge. Out of self-preservation. You tried to take everything from me. My home, my independence, my dignity. And you expected me to smile and let you. My son finally spoke, and his voice cracked down the middle. Mom, we didn't mean. You didn't mean for me to find out, I said. That's all. The truth hung between us like a weight none of them wanted to lift. You were going to leave tonight and come back when it was convenient, I continued. You thought the door would always open. You thought I would always be grateful for crumbs of kindness. But you forgot something. What? My daughter whispered, her voice suddenly small. This is my home, I said. My life. My choice. A long silence followed. Longer than any of us had ever sat in together. Waited. Breathed. I let them feel the consequences of their own decisions for once. And standing behind that closed door, I realized something profound. They never expected to face the truth. They never expected the door to stay shut. They never expected me to finally choose myself. But I had. And I wasn't going back. Inside the quiet house, their voices still murmuring on the porch, I walked to my bedroom as if pulled by something old and heavy. I opened the drawer of my nightstand, a drawer I had not touched in months because it held too much of what I wasn't ready to face. Papers, printed emails, old phone bills, bank statements folded neatly, screenshots tucked inside envelopes. Proof. Not of what they had done, but of how long I had been carrying a love no one returned. I sat on the edge of my bed and unlocked my phone, scrolling through years of messages that had become fossils of a relationship eroded by neglect. There were strings of texts from me, checking in, asking if they arrived safely, reminding them of birthdays, holidays, dinners I cooked and waited for them to show up. Each thread told its own story. My son often left my messages marked "read" with no reply. My daughter replied with one-word answers, cut short, rushed, uninterested. I scrolled past last year's Mother's Day. I had sent a simple message. Lunch on Sunday? I'd love to see you both. My son responded 2 days later with, busy. My daughter never answered at all. Farther down were the messages from holidays they said they'd come home for. Pictures of half-cooked meals I had prepared to show them I was excited. Reminders I sent gently. Dinner starts at 6. Drive safe. See you soon. Followed always by a cancellation. Traffic. Weather. Work. Always excuses, never apologies. I set the phone down and reached for the folder underneath a stack of receipts. Inside were the bank transfers. Rent I had covered, utilities I had paid, deposits I had sent, just this once that turned into habit. Every time I sent money, it was followed by a promise. I'll pay you back soon, Mom. None of them ever did. I found the screenshot I took last year, the one that hurt the most. A social media post from my daughter, smiling in a restaurant on a night she had told me she was too sick to visit. The caption read, "Family dinner." They were all there, her husband, my son, his spouse. All of them together. Without me. My invitation had been a lie they never intended to honor. I folded the screenshot back into the envelope and stared at the wall, letting the truth wash over me slowly. I had been clinging to the idea that my children were simply busy, that life had swallowed them in responsibilities. But the evidence laid out in front of me showed a different picture. I wasn't forgotten by accident. I was excluded with consistency. The bank statements were the hardest to look at. Not because of the money, but because each transfer was a timestamp of my hope. Hope that they needed me. Hope that helping them would make them come home. Hope that love, poured out endlessly, would eventually be reflected back. But all it showed was a pattern. They called when their accounts were empty. They texted when they were in trouble. They visited when they had no other option. They loved me when it was convenient. I ran my fingers slowly over the pages, feeling the ridges where I had pressed too hard while filing them away. Back when I still thought things would get better. Back when I believed effort alone could repair what was breaking. Outside, my children knocked again, softer this time, no longer commanding but uncertain. But I didn't go to the door. Not yet. Not while the truth lay spread across my bed like a map showing every path I had taken that led me here. A mother can survive heartbreak. What she cannot survive is pretending it never happened. And tonight, for the first time, I wasn't pretending anymore. They stayed on the porch longer than I thought they would, long after the light from the hallway stopped spilling through the doorframe. I could hear their footsteps shifting, pacing at first, then slowing as the reality began to settle in. The same reality I had been living through quietly for years. The door was no longer theirs to walk through. My home was no longer a place they could treat like a waiting room for their convenience. And for the first time, I wasn't the one left standing outside looking in. Their spouses lasted only minutes before the cracks began to show. My son-in-law was the first to snap. His voice escalated, sharp and impatient, as he hissed at my daughter about wasting time, and letting this turn into drama. He'd been able to manipulate her easily when I was in the room, when he had an audience to impress, someone to blame. But standing outside a closed door, with no one to override my voice with his own, he suddenly found himself powerless. And he hated the feeling. "This is ridiculous," he muttered loudly enough for me to hear. "If she wants to act crazy, let her. We're leaving." My daughter protested, her voice cracking in a way I hadn't heard since she was a child. But her husband didn't stay to listen. His footsteps marched down the driveway, car door slamming a moment later. My son's wife held out longer, arguing, pleading, then blaming, cycling through every familiar tactic. She demanded explanations, demanded control, demanded a version of events that painted her as the victim. But when none of it worked, when the door remained closed and my silence remained unbroken, she finally snapped too. "This is what you deserve," she spat at my son. "I told you your mother was unstable. I told you this would happen. Handle it." Then she walked away as well, heels clicking like gavel strikes against the pavement. Another car door slammed. Another engine roared out of the driveway. And then there were only two voices left, my children. For the first time in years, they were alone with the truth of their own actions, without anyone else to soften the blow or redirect the blame. The porch creaked as they sank onto the steps, the weight of everything beginning to settle onto their shoulders in ways it never had before. I heard my daughter sniffle quietly. "What did we do?" she whispered, not to me but to the air around her. A question she had never let herself ask. A question no one had ever forced her to answer. My son didn't reply. Not right away. I imagined him staring at the dark yard, replaying the things he'd said to me over the years. Every dismissal, every ignored message, every moment he chose convenience over compassion. The silence between them stretched thin, trembling with regret that neither of them seemed prepared to carry. He finally spoke, voice low and heavy. "She knew," he said. "About everything." Another silence. This one sharper. They both knew what everything meant. The plans whispered behind my back. The attempts to access my accounts. The tours of facilities they had no right to arrange. The choice to leave me behind without even asking what I wanted. My daughter exhaled shakily. "We didn't mean to hurt her." "But we did," he answered. "We really did." For years, I had been the one absorbing every wound, every thoughtless comment, every forgotten promise. For years, I had stood alone with the pieces of a family falling apart. Tonight, those pieces finally fell into their hands instead. As the night deepened, they stayed on the porch, quiet, unmoving, without the comfort of their spouses or the shield of excuses. They had expected to walk out of my life easily, cleanly, like closing a book they were done reading. But now they were left sitting outside a home they once belonged to, realizing that love is not something you can abandon and expect to find unchanged when you return. It was the first night in a very long time that I didn't feel alone, because they finally felt the loss too. The days that followed were quiet, but not in the way emptiness feels. It was a different kind of quiet, the kind that settles slowly like dust after a storm, softening the air instead of suffocating it. For the first time in years, I didn't listen for footsteps in the hallway or doors opening at odd hours. I didn't wait for someone to need something from me. The house felt still, yes, but it felt like mine again. On the first morning alone, I stood in the kitchen and made breakfast for one. I scrambled a single egg, toasted one slice of bread, and brewed coffee just the way I liked it, strong, dark, and without rushing. I sat at the small table by the window and let the silence come. It didn't hurt the way I once feared it would. Instead, the quiet felt like warm hands smoothing down my shoulders, inviting me to sit, breathe, exist without being needed. I noticed the way the morning sun touched the curtains. I tasted my food instead of eating mindlessly. I felt present in a way I hadn't in years. In the afternoon, I watered my plants, slowly, without the hurried pace I'd adopted when the house was full and tense. My plants had survived neglect better than I had, their leaves reaching toward the light with quiet determination. I trimmed dead stems, repotted the ones that needed space, and whispered apologies to them, as if they too had been waiting for this peace. Eventually I stepped outside and walked down the street. My neighbors, the ones I had once chatted with during summer barbecues and holiday gatherings, waved when they saw me. I stopped to talk with Mrs. Ramirez and her husband, something I hadn't taken the time to do in far too long. They told me about their grandchildren, about the school fair, about the little things that weave a community together. I realized how much life I had missed while shrinking myself to fit inside the narrow space my children allowed me. A few days later, I visited the community center. I had passed it 100 times, always thinking, maybe someday. That someday finally arrived. I signed up to help in the afternoons, sorting donations, preparing meals, sitting with seniors who just needed company. It was humbling, grounding work. No one there knew me as a mother who wasn't enough, or as someone whose love was dismissed. They knew me only as a woman who showed up. And showing up felt good. Each day, I filled the hours with small choices that were entirely my own. I read books I had once set aside. I repaired the old bird feeder in the yard. I took long walks at dusk when the sky softened into shades of peach and lavender. The world didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt spacious, and my heart, for the first time in years, felt like it had room to stretch. I wasn't replacing my children. I wasn't punishing them. I wasn't trying to prove anything. I was simply rediscovering myself, the person I had been before I began pouring every drop of myself into people who no longer wanted what I offered. At night, I cooked dinner for one again. I lit a candle. I played music softly in the background. And instead of loneliness, I felt something else entirely. The kind that comes not from being surrounded, but from being whole. Months passed before they finally came back. Not all at once, not with the swagger or certainty they once carried, but quietly, almost cautiously, like people approaching a place they were no longer sure they had the right to enter. It was a Sunday afternoon when I heard the knock, not the frantic pounding from that night, but a hesitant tapping, the kind that carried apology instead of entitlement. I stood in the hallway for a moment, letting the sound settle before walking toward the door. Through the peephole I saw them standing together. My son, hands shoved deep into his pockets, eyes fixed on the porch boards. My daughter, twisting her fingers the way she used to when she was nervous as a child. They looked smaller somehow, older but softer, as if the time away had forced them to sit with truths they had spent years running from. Their spouses were nowhere in sight. They had come alone. I opened the door only as far as the chain allowed. A narrow space, enough to see their faces but not enough for them to cross the threshold. The symbolism wasn't lost on any of us. "Mom!" my daughter whispered, her voice cracking on the single syllable. Can we talk? Her brother nodded beside her, eyes glassy, heavy with regret. Please. I didn't speak right away. I let the silence fill the space like a mirror, showing them the consequences of their choices. They shifted uncomfortably, waiting for anger, for tears, for the emotional collapse they once assumed I would always fall into. But I was steady. What do you want to talk about? I asked gently. They exchanged a glance, the kind that used to hold arrogance but now held only humility. My son stepped forward, stopping just short of the chain. We messed up, he said. We didn't see what we were doing. We didn't see you. My daughter swallowed hard. We're not here to ask for anything. We just want to understand, and maybe fix things. If you'll let us. Their words were earnest, but words alone could not rebuild what had been broken through years of neglect and entitlement. I listened to them, yes, but I did not bend. That was the difference now. I knew how to listen without surrendering myself in the process. I appreciate that you came, I said softly. But you need to understand something. This door, I touched the chain, letting the metal click faintly, is closed for a reason. I didn't change the locks to shut you out permanently. I changed them to protect myself. My daughter wiped her eyes, tears sliding down without shame. We want to do better. He nodded. I believe you. But doing better doesn't mean stepping back into this house as if nothing happened. They both lowered their heads, accepting the boundary they once thought I would never draw. This home, I continued, is still mine. Not because you left, but because I stayed. Because I took care of it when you didn't. Because I rebuilt my peace in the space you took for granted. My son's voice shook. Is there any way back? There may be, I said. But not through this door today. Trust needs to be rebuilt outside first. Respect too. Those things don't start with keys. They start with actions. They nodded, understanding even if it hurt. They stepped back from the porch, wiping their faces, looking like children again. Not in age, but in vulnerability. As I closed the door gently, not harshly, not triumphantly, I left them with the truth that had carried me through the darkest nights and the quietest mornings. The home you abandoned is still mine. And the mother you ignored. She learned to live without you.